Anyone feel like this today? I've got a new guided note sheet for you guys to fill out for this on Schoology, and I've got paper copies for those who want one. So we're going to start out today with a little reflection activity. In that space I gave you at the top of your guided note sheet, I want to know what stresses you out. So write at least 5 different stressors that cause stress for you in your life. Now I want you to come write one of your stressors up on the board around my stress bubble here. And if we have repeats, that's okay, so don't worry about that. But write one stressor. Feeling stress is a pretty natural part of life. I'd like to tell you that it gets better as you get older, but it doesn't. You tend to get more stressors, but you do get better at handling them. All stress is the reaction of the body to everyday challenges and demands. It can appear pretty quickly, like when you're running late or running to catch the bus, or like if you remembered you forgot to do something important, or it can slowly build for days, like when let's say you find out you have a big test coming up. You might not feel stressed right away. You might feel a little bit of stressed when you hear about this thing, but you won't feel your highest degree of stress until probably the day before or right before you take that test. So it does build slowly over time. In order to know what we need to do to cope with stress, we also need to know what causes it. So anything that causes stress is called a stressor. Stressors range from everyday annoyances to serious personal problems. They can be people, objects, places, events, and situations. Those are all potential stressors, and they affect people in different ways. For example, if I had to audition for a musical theater production, I would find that situation extremely stressful. I'm not a singer. Memorizing lines is not my forte. I'm not good at it. I don't like to do it. So I would be super stressed about that. But one of my friends who does theater for a living in Chicago would find that same situation exciting. She would be amped and ready to go and excited to audition for this theater production. And that's because stress is all based on our perception. It's all based on how we view a situation or how our senses become aware of a situation. So if that same musical theater production stressor, I view that stressor very stressful, whereas my friend would view that stressor not very stressful because of the way we view it. Another example would be, let's say I get in an argument with my best friend. I might feel that I have completely ruined our relationship, friendship over, years of friendship down the drain because of something that happened or something I said. So based on my perception, I'm really stressed out about this. But my friend might be like, ugh, that's just Miss Lushbell being weird, dumb, whatever. She'll get over it. We'll take a break for a few days and then we'll be fine. So my friend would feel a lower level of stress about that situation, that same event, because she perceives it differently than I do. Whereas I'm going to have a higher degree of stress or feel a lot more stressed on that same situation because of how I perceive it or how I view it. Not all stress is necessarily bad, though. We do experience good stress or positive stress, which is called eustress. Eustress can make your life more pleasurable because it can help you reach your goals and motivate you to do your best. So it might give you the extra energy and motivation to study for a test that you want to do well on. It might give you the extra energy and motivation to train for a game or a race or a tournament or prepare for an audition for a play or practice a piece of music for a concert. So that's the type of stress we want to have in our lives. It challenges us. It helps us grow. But we typically associate stress as a negative thing, and we do experience stress that is not good for us or unhealthy. This type of stress or negative stress is called distress, and this type of stress is damaging to the brain and the body. A person might react to this type of stress by having an upset stomach, like before giving a presentation, or by losing sleep after arguing with a friend. So when we react to stress, our bodies go through a very specific biological process. When a person perceives something to be dangerous, difficult, or painful, their body automatically begins this stress response, or the fight or flight response, as you've more commonly probably heard it. This is a psychological response, so it's regulated by our brain and our body. It is something that is developed in the earliest of earliest humans because they needed to perceive stressors and decide an appropriate action to take, because stressors at that time were usually something that were threatening to their lives. We don't today most often experience stressors that are threatening to our lives, but we still perceive them in that same way and still react in that same way. It's something we can't help because it's just our natural response to our body. So because it is a psychological response, it is regulated by the nervous system, or the brain, and the endocrine system. The endocrine system is the system in our body that regulates all of our hormones, so it controls what hormones are released and when and how much they're released. The endocrine system is controlled by the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is the small part of the brain that is like the general of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus receives the danger signals from some other part of the brain and says, oh, this is dangerous. We got to do something about this. I don't like this. I'm not quite comfortable. And it sends a message to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is kind of like the second in command of the endocrine system. It always receives its orders from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus sends the pituitary glands a hormone that says we need to do something about the stressor. And then the pituitary gland sends a message to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are located right on top of the kidneys, and they receive this message from the pituitary gland that says that they need to release two new hormones, which are the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline is responsible for causing all of those physical symptoms we feel when we experience that fight or flight response. So what adrenaline does is it dilates pupils because we need to take in more visual stimuli to fight or flee. It increases in perspiration, or you start sweating more. Your heart rate increases and your pulse increase. There's a rise in blood pressure, so our blood circulates faster. Our breathing rate also increases. The arteries that feed blood to our internal organs and skin narrow because we don't need like our stomach or intestines or our spleen to fight or flee. Instead, the body diverts that blood flow to our muscles and brain because that's what we need to fight or flee. Lastly, there's an increase in muscle tension. So the body's getting ready to do something and take action. So our muscles get ready to go. So I have a commercial, which is from the Netherlands, I think. So it's in a different language, but it has subtitles. But it does a great job showing those physical symptoms of that stress response and of adrenaline. So see if you can pick out a few of those symptoms of adrenaline in this commercial. Cortisol is a steroid hormone that's responsible for a wide range of processes throughout our body. It plays a role in how we metabolize food, our immune response, as well as helping our body respond to stress. So it is activated in that fight or flight response. And what cortisol does is it triggers a release of blood sugar, fats, and cholesterol. These are things that we use for energy. So essentially what it's doing is it's putting more energy into our blood so we can use it to fight or flee. Our bodies also go through a 3-stage process when we react to stress. That first stage is the alarm stage. This is where your mind and body are going on high alert. So this is where the stage you would start to feel the effects of that fight or flight response, specifically the effects of adrenaline. So what your body is doing in the alarm stage is it's preparing itself to either defend itself or flee from a threat. If the stressor continues, then we enter into that resistance phase. So what the body does in this stage is it adjusts or adapts to the stressor if it continues over that longer period of time. So this would be, for example, when you have enough energy to perform in a really big basketball game or a really long race, or the extra energy to last through an entire musical theater production. Eventually, though, if a stressor lasts for too long, our bodies can't deal with that. If we're exposed to stress for too long, our body actually loses its ability to adapt, and it also loses the ability to effectively deal with other stressors that might occur. So we don't handle those things as well. So acute stress, or that immediate reaction to stress where we're going through that fight or flight response, is not so bad. I mean, it might not feel good in the moment, but in the long run, it's not going to be so damaging to our mind and body. Because once the threat has passed, our level of stress hormones that we are like surge in our body, cortisol and adrenaline, decrease. With chronic stress or long-term stress, that's going to be a problem. When we experience chronic stress, even though that fight or flight response goes away, so adrenaline stops being pumped into our bodies, the levels of cortisol in our blood still remain high. And cortisol is what damages the mind and body if we have too much of it for a long period of time. Having too much cortisol in our blood for a long period of time affects all aspects of our health and leads to what we call a psychosomatic response. So a psychosomatic response is a physical reaction that results from something psychological, like stress, rather than from something else that's physical, like an injury or illness. So something psychological is causing physical reactions and physical damage in our body. Having too much cortisol in our blood over a long period of time is associated with a lot of negative effects. It decreases our immune system, so it makes it easier to get sick and it harder to recover from illnesses. It increases abdominal fat, so it causes weight gain, and particularly in that abdominal area, which is not good. The closer you carry your fat to your heart, the higher the risk of a heart attack, which is why we associate high stress levels with heart attacks. It can break down muscles, bones, and connective tissues. It inhibits hormone activity, so it can cause infertility. It can cause insomnia, as well as acne, anger, depression, and anxiety. We're going to focus on a couple of these areas of the body and how cortisol affects those. So we're going to start with the heart. An increase in cortisol causes our blood vessels to constrict, so they get narrower, which means the space for blood to travel through is less, which means the heart has to pump harder to get the same amount of blood throughout our body. High levels of cortisol release fatty acids and plaque that build up in the bloodstream. They glob onto our artery walls, which also narrows the space for blood to travel through. And if that space, particularly in the arteries that feed blood to our heart, our coronary arteries get completely blocked, that's what causes a heart attack. High cortisol levels also greatly affect our brain, so I've got a quick video here that will talk about how and what areas of the brain are affected, and then we'll talk about it. So the hippocampus is the green part of the brain in the very middle of the brain where all of our learning and memory happen. It's where we learn new things. That's where we form long-term memory. So when our levels of cortisol are high, we don't remember things as well, and it's harder to learn, especially new things. The frontal lobe is where our executive functioning is housed. It's the very front of the brain, this purple area in the front, particularly our decision and judgment skills. So when we have too much cortisol, it's harder to make good decisions and use good judgment. Lastly, dopamine and serotonin are affected by high levels of cortisol. These are two neurotransmitters or brain chemicals that carry messages between neurons related to how happy we feel, how calm we feel, and they also help to regulate our mood and emotions. When we have high levels of cortisol, those messages don't get delivered as well, which is why we see an increased risk of developing anxiety and depression. Cortisol also causes the liver to produce excess glucose or blood sugar, which increases the chance of developing type 2 diabetes and also increases the chance of gaining weight, especially in the abdominal area. Lastly, using alcohol or drugs to cope with stress, which is not a healthy coping skill, usually creates more problems and more stress, especially when a person begins abusing those substances.